Okay. Hello, everyone. 22 October. This and that. Lovely day. 2 weeks until the election. Came across some new stuff. Still the reason to be on Twitter in some ways until we all kind of finally reject it. A new book is coming out from Nick Bernard's called Fictions of Financialization, Rethinking Speculation, Exploitation, and 21st Century Capitalism. And yes, financialization we've been looking at for weeks now. And essentially, I came across another review because I think maybe for a while I'm going to just read reviews here because that's better than having to slog through a bunch of other things and maybe perhaps lose everyone in the theoretical. This book just came out on Pluto and makes the case against the dominance of this story, arguing that the concept of financialization is ill understood and overworked. Bernard's shows how we risk glossing over the true nature of capitalism when focusing on the mythical powers of finance. The moralistic distinction between harmful financial and more honest, quote unquote, real economies leads to an impasse if we want to better understand how exploitation truly manifests. Rather than indulging in the harmful fantasy that confronting the financial elite will fix the economy, Bernard's provides an alternative approach, starting from the premise that risk and speculation are core to the operation of all capital and not just the hallmark of a perverted financial sector. This Marxist reading of the interconnection between capitalism's uneven exploitation of labor and nature and financial capital lays the groundwork for a much needed view of the real powers of finance. So this, there's a certain set of propositions here that is will be raised, opposed in the next review. Bernard shows that the dizzying complexity of modern financial markets must be grounded in capitalism's ecocidal and crisis-prone motion. And I don't think there's any denying that. But anyway, he on Twitter, he includes a pretty decent bibliography pursuing, I put in a link to Simon Clark's stuff. And we've looked at Simon Clark's stuff before. He's done summaries of Capital, the 3 volumes, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, Bernard's in his own little Twitter thread here talks about the kind of key documents of writing on money and finance, which includes, of course, Suzanne de Bonoff and a bunch of other stuff. But he posts at least this first little thing here, which is about, he begins talking about the council or consortium of socialist economists. And yes, there are socialist economists, and they do have like little clubs and stuff like that in the European context. God knows whether it exists on this side of the pond. And it's a little review of Ben Fine's book, or Ben Fine and Lawrence Harris's book, Rereading Capital, which is a classic text. This is during the period when you have Steedman and a bunch of other folks trying to work through value problems. The essential point is surely that the concept of value is not necessarily, it's not necessary, so long as Marxism is seen as a technical economic theory concerned only with the production and distribution of use values. The concept of value expresses the critical, dialectical power of Marxist theory, directing our attention beyond the apparent separation of production and exchange, departments 1 and 2, to their fundamental unity as forms of capitalist class relations. The point is not that value is a concept expressing abstraction from exchange. It is that both the production and the distribution of the social product are only determined within the class relation between capital and labor. So in other words, there is a relationship between, that value, well, the point is not that value is a concept expressing abstraction, but rather that it is both production and distribution of social product. They're only determined within the class relation between capital and labor. Thus, the necessity of value expresses the primacy of this class relation, not the primacy of production. And of course, that's the thing we've sort of gone already through, is the bias towards production or productionism, maybe not accounting for the issues of class relative to consumption or distribution, which, obviously is much messier, right? You have better control over the factory than you have over the market. And, the people shy away from it. It's problematic. It's messy, difficult, has conflicts. But that doesn't mean to say we should ignore it, because that's the whole point of the volumes 2 and 3, is to say, well, as much as we want to convert and control the means of production, doesn't mean anything unless you're, manifesting it in reality and, working within it as a culture. The transformation of value into price does not, therefore, express some purely economic relationship between production and circulation, 1 and 2. It expresses the distinction between the distribution of the social product between capital and labor and the redistribution of the surplus product within the capitalist class, which takes place through the equalization of the rate of profit and the formation of rent, interest, and the profit of enterprise. And that's kind of the whole thing at work there. There's surplus product gets made and it gets redistributed, and some folks get more of it than others. And there are instruments by which that happens. And unfortunately, speaking just from one point of view, people submit. Thus, it expresses the fundamental difference between relations between classes and relations within classes. This fundamental difference is not compromised by the secondary economic consideration that the equalization of the rate of profit can also affect a degree of redistribution between classes. So the point is that you have power relations, of course, but also you have actual measures of stuff, particularly at scale, and the rate of profit gives you a peek at that. And it complicates issues when you assume that, there is some, sort of synchrony between value and price. This is not simply a technical point. Marx's abstraction is not based on the logical or empirical primacy of production. It's returning back to that original determinist point. It is based on the discovery that the class relation between capital and labor is centered on the exchange of labor power for capital and the subordination of social production to the production of surplus value. In other words, you don't really have control over your own stuff, and in some ways you're sort of forced to make, Ferraris or whatever. This is the core of Marx's theory of capital, and it is on this basis that Marx could develop his critique of petty bourgeois socialism that saw the evils of capitalism as the result of the subordination of production to the market. This is the key element in the 19th century, and causes lots of issues between utopians or anarchists, a whole bunch of other folks. This has obvious political implications for the transition to socialism. Socialism could only be achieved by abolishing the class relation between labor and capital. It cannot be achieved by abolishing the social character of labor or the equalization of the rate of profit. So, in other words, some things, are sort of, after the fact. They measure sort of things we would like to think about. Well, how is it that, we have a professional managerial class, and what is the relationship of, profits to different sectors of the economy? And, why is it difficult to equalize the rate of profit, or why is equalization of the rate of profit a prerequisite to working this all through? And that's the question that's raised in this subsequent review, which just came out yesterday. It is in my Twitter feed is Brave New Europe, which has a whole bunch of different folks in it, Brankovic and a bunch of other folks, and is quite timely. It has included in it Michael Roberts, who is important because, as we've looked at before, Michael Roberts is a guy who spent a little time in the city of London, and has a handle a little bit on the both the actual empirical aspects of finance, but also is a Marxist. The idea, this is from the review, the idea that there is another source of profit does not work for me. And this is that question of, where does profit come from? What is profit? Is profit surplus value? No, it isn't. Surplus value is a component of profit, but there's other stuff going on. Profit upon alienation is an idea that comes from an early classical economist, James Stewart. Some Marxist economists, like Anwar Sheikh, who I mentioned before, that I went to two different online lectures of him about his stuff, and how it kind of represents not only a return to reconsidering classical economics or classical political economy, but also that all the data to analyze the things that we wanted to analyze, like surplus value, et cetera, are sort of there. It's just that no one measures it. No one has chosen to measure it. And yet he's sort of forcing forward a research program that looks at World Bank data, International Monetary Fund data, all the standard data, and shows how some of this operates. And it's not biasing the data. It's just nobody looks at it. And he doesn't step into certain places that are problematic. On the other hand, he makes some important judgments about the quality of North-South relations and a variety of other stuff. And it seems Tonak and Duman, who have written this new book, interpret Marx to have accepted Stewart's concept of profit from alienation as another source of profit that does not come from the exploitation of labor in production, but from the circulation of capital. And this is that continuing key point. This is the congealed question. Is it always congealed? Is it not congealed? Is congealed a stupid idea? Labor and production is one thing, but one can assert, and this is supported by Marx himself, without getting into a thicket on this, the circulation of capital still requires labor. It's just not the same kind of labor, and kinds of labor are the problem. It's one that Marx didn't quite get to, even though he sort of assumes that he's gotten to it, and that is the idea of mental labor, or however you want to talk about it, knowledge, and in that particular context. And it has the same logical conditions, I think, that would address Hegel's objections and a variety of other things. So I don't find it problematic, but obviously the reviewer, Michael Roberts, does, and you want to sort of see why he does it that way, and you can agree or disagree. But it is speaking as an academic, it's in the disagreement we sort of figure out, well, yeah or no, and work out, whether we can falsify it, prove it, use it to support other kinds of research, etc. In the tracks of Marx's Capital, Debates in Marxian Political Economy and Lessons for 21st Century Capitalism is an important new book by two well-known Marxist economists from Turkey. Yes, that country, the one without the gravy. Ahmet Tonak and Sungur Savran bring together a series of works written by them over the last 40 years that track the development and relevance of Marx's analysis of the capitalist mode of production to the present day. Sungur Savran teaches at Istanbul Okan University, and Ahmet Tonak is a research affiliate at Smith College and teaches at UMass Amherst. Tonak is, one of the army of graduate students for Anwar Sheikh. And yes, it does seem like an army after a while. The book is divided into 4 parts to explore the core ideas of Marxian political economy relevant for modern day economics. The first part gives an overview of capital, Marx's Capital, and its methodology. The second part discusses the application of these ideas to the question of measuring what is profit on alienation, whatever that is, the rate of exploitation, the reconstruction of input-output tables, and the role of the welfare state and social wage. That's all the stuff for a modern economy, and is the kind of post-war developments that have been really important. That is the input-output table, which only comes from, it goes all the way back to the physiocrats, we know. But it is also the way in which a modern, large scale national economy, econometric models, the Fed uses, a version of this, but, it's only part of the bigger things they do. The third part discusses new research in Marxian analysis in the 21st century, facing the challenges brought about by digital labor and the global economic crisis. In the final part, Singer Sovran discusses the differences between Marxist value theory and Sraffian neo-Ricardian economics. Now, if you will recall, this is the kind of fundamental fight in the post-war period for a subsection of heterodox economics. So the big picture is, yes, there's post-Keynesianism, which is the easiest dodge to not be being called a Marxist, particularly if you're on a conservative American economics faculty. And, this sort of the Donald Harris sort of deal. He's essentially a Sraffian neo-Ricardian on one hand. On the other hand, he's always trying to work out the problem between that and Marxist value theory. And it's all there in his writing. It's not disguised or coded like you would sort of charge Minsky or Kalecki with. But, that's a whole nother set of, research. Overall, the aim of the book of these two guys is to develop an adequate analysis of capitalism with a view to counter and finally overcome the exploitation, oppression, and alienation that this mode of production offers humanity. Now, that's a pretty broad, a bold idea, but worth working on. In part one, Tanak takes the reader on a trip through Marx's first notes on his analysis of capitalism as expressed in what is now called the Grundrisse, written during the year after a major economic crisis in 1857. There's huge panic and a bunch of other crazy stuff happens. Tanak discusses the historical context and the content of the text in detail and summarizes Marx's main arguments on alienation, value, and post-capitalism. So at this moment, we're still back to talking about the Grundrisse, a text which never really got published, and in Marx's time, certainly, but does open up, and particularly if you're humanist at all, you begin to see, what did he really mean? That it provides new insights on what Marx meant before it gets to 1859 and the 1864 manuscripts and blah, 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 blah. Sovran takes up the story with two chapters dealing with the key points in all three volumes of Marx's masterpiece, Capital. Sovran emphasizes the radical difference between Marx's understanding of capitalism compared to the classical economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo. Sovran makes the very important point, often ignored by other Marxist economists, that capital was seen by Marx as a critique of political economy as it was in the 1850s, not just a development of the classical school, as many eminent contemporary Marxist economists like Anwar Sheikh appear to argue. As Sovran says, capital should be understood as a wholesale criticism of that school. While the classical economists recognize that value in an economy was created by human labor power, they deny the contradictory character of capitalist accumulation, i.e., the exploitation of labor by capital. And so the causes of regular and recurring crises in capitalist production and investment. As Engels said, one of the great discoveries of Marx was surplus value, how the owners of the means of production appropriate a surplus from the producers of value, that is the labor force, seemingly through equal exchange, that is wages for labor. Now, this is ignored by the classical economists. What is more, Sovran insists that while the classical economists assume that capitalism as a mode of production is here to stay forever and never question the categories of capitalism, such as value, money, wage, labor, profit, etc., Marx dwelt at length on these categories themselves and laid bare the historically specific and transitory relations of production that they embodied. And now, this is just, Marx does care about, all of these things that are being oppressed by, terrible people, people in power, whether it's Germans or French or Brits or whatever. In the next chapter, both authors combine to present the very important distinction in capitalist production between productive and unproductive labor. This is a continuing issue. by looking at the different branches of activity in the modern economy. Marx says that new value is only created by human labor power, but not all labor. Productive labor for capital consists of those sections of labor that create new value for the owners of the means of production. Unproductive labor is due to those sections of labor that meet often very important economic needs, but do so in exchange for wages paid out of the surplus value created by the productive sectors. So in other words, there's a kind of pseudo clearing, but yet there's stuff being made out of the new stuff or new surplus. But this does not imply in any sense that they are any less important either for the well-being of society or the class struggle. And in fact, how in some cases, how could you even measure it? State employees, teachers, social workers, health workers are unproductive for capitalism as they do not deliver new value and surplus value for capital. Indeed, their wages are a deduction from overall surplus value. Now that's an important point that is problematic in the national accounts that, you sort of have to work through. When you do, you don't sort of believe that position. That partly explains why capital is so opposed to state spending and investment and in favor of privatization. The whole business of, school vouchers, health insurance, all of those things we're fighting about now is exactly this problem, a perception that something is more productive than the other. And from the point of view of Marx's analysis, it clarifies the need to look at the profitability of productive labor as the key indicator of the quote-unquote health of capitalism. Tonak was joint author with Anwar Sheikh of the seminal work Measuring the Wealth of Nations, the Political Economy of National Accounts, which measures the production of nations using Marxist categories of productive and unproductive labor. And in another chapter, Tonak and Yigit Karahanogulari, yeah, Turkish, clarify the distinction between productive and unproductive labor. It first defines the meaning of exploitation based on the Marxian labor theory of value, on which the sole criterion of being exploited becomes the appropriation of surplus labor, even of those unproductive workers, laborers, and then empirically estimates rates of exploitation of those unproductive workers in Turkey's government, finance, and trade sectors. Talk about empirical. In another chapter, Tonak joins with Alper Duman to apply the Marxist classifications of productive and unproductive labor to economies using input-output tables. This reveals the dynamics of capitalist production, unlike mainstream classification left simply at manufacturing and services. Now, so much of the problem of defining the economy is the kind of categorization, and there are labor categories, and there's a whole deal that is that was created for very good reasons. You had to sort of figure out how much were we making, what was being wasted, how are we going to defeat the Germans with this, essentially is what it boiled down to. But it is an important element that often people ignore. In part two, Tonak and Alper Duman discuss the vexed, in my opinion, Robert's opinion, question of the category profit, the category called profit on alienation. Profit on alienation, POA, is presented as an extra source of profit in capitalist economies, in addition to the profit appropriated in capitalist production. This rubs against my view, this Robert's talking, it rubs against my view of Marx's value theory of equalities of value, mainly that total value equals total prices of production in the aggregate after the redistribution of value between capitals. And so total surplus value will also equal total profit, interest, and rent. Now, I would assert that this is a little too absolute, and I think there's a lot of other issues. But anyway, these equalities support the view that only labor creates value, and it is the distribution and circulation of that value that leads to unequal shares of total value. So you can see already that there's certain kind of definitional issues of, sort of defining things. The idea that there's another source of profit does not work for me. Profit upon alienation is an idea that comes from an early classical economist, James Stewart. Some Marxist economists, like Anwar Sheikh, and it seems Tonak and Duman follow him, interpret Marx to have accepted Stewart's concept of profit from alienation as another source of profit that does not come from the exploitation of labor in production, but from the circulation of capital. So in other words, profit from alienation comes from capital circulation. It's in the circuitry, not in the production. Reminding ourselves, of course, that these are all interconnected, and problematized for a whole variety of other reasons. So, making this distinction, could be just simply a false one. But I don't think Marx says this is Roberts. But I don't think Marx says this about Stewart's concept. On the contrary, when you read what Marx says about Stewart's classification, Marx says, quote, before the physiocrats, surplus value, that is profit in the form of profit, was explained purely from exchange, the sale of the commodity above its value. Sir James Stewart, on the whole, did not get beyond this restricted view, but he must rather be regarded as the man who reproduced it in scientific form. I say in scientific form, for Stewart does not share the illusion that the surplus value which accrues to the individual capitalist from selling the commodity above its value, the markup, is a creation of new wealth. And Marx goes on, this profit, quote, this profit upon alienation, therefore, arises from the price of goods being greater than their real value, or from the goods being sold above their value. Gain on the one side, therefore, always involves loss on the other. No addition to the general stock is created. But his, quote, his theory of vibration of the balance of wealth between parties, however little it touches the nature and origin of surplus value itself, remains important in considering the distribution of surplus value among different classes and among different categories, such as profit, interest, and rent. That is emphasized by Roberts. So there is no new profit from trade or transfer. This relative profit is just that, it's relative. Why does Sheikh, however, want to make so much of this? Unfortunately, Anwar Sheikh accepts that Marx's equivalence, that is total value equals total price, surplus value equal profit, do not hold, which is the neo-Ricardian critique. So he seeks to restore the equalities by finding new value from outside the exploitation of labor and production. Also, this supposedly helps explain how in the 20th century, finance capital can gain extra profit from outside production. This extra profit comes from revenue, i.e. profit circulating or hoarded and now outside production, just as a burglar can gain profit from stealing and selling on, so can a banker from extorting extra interest and fees from workers' savings and mortgages. Now, let me break here for the moment and mention, of course, when I brought up valorization before, that is, I think, one of the reasons why it's never even quite evens out. But anyway, back to Roberts. Now, finance capital can gain profit from slicing off a bit of workers' wages in bank interest or.
Don't want to interrupt, but Joe just said he lost power. And he's given you back host. I guess there's a citywide blackout in Turkey. You shouldn't have mentioned Turkey, I guess.
Yeah, that they were listening. Marx
Just
came up and they just lopped off his neighborhood power. Okay, we're almost done. Now, finance capital can gain profit from slicing off a bit of workers' wages in bank interest or from squeezing the profit of an enterprise, non-financial capital, which is perhaps what Tonak and Duman mean. But this is not an extra source of profit, but merely a redistribution of surplus value or a reduction of the value of labor power. It does not mean that finance capital creates a new source of value in the circulation of capital. And it's an essentialist argument, but an interesting one. This is it new or not? Is it unique or not? Does it fall outside of whatever? What is your concept of, that I would like to think that it's not so much that it's a new source, it's just simply redefining this big thing called capital in another subdivision, which should not be problematic, but hence it has become. In my view, that is in Robert's view, it is wrong that an extra source of profit must be added into economic accounts within Marxist theory, or for that matter, even within the classical tradition as suggested by Stewart. This concedes to the ambiguities, yes, of the modern financialization theories, which we looked at with Hudson's work, namely that it is finance alone that is now the exploiter, not capital as such. That does not mean that we should not estimate the amount of profit being gained from workers' wages through mortgage interest and house prices by the financial sector. Certainly, that's what Hudson's all about. And Tonak and Duman provide just that with their empirical examples in the chapter. But this financial profit is just part of total surplus value appropriated by producer capitalists and redistributed to finance capitalists through interest and rent and or from workers' wages, that is variable capital, constant variable capital, etc. The examples show financial profits, much of it fictitious in the Marxist sense. You see, it all comes back to the fictitious question. It's not so much that it's new, it's just another version of the fictitious. But anyway, moreover, it is not necessary to find another source of profit to balance the Marxian equations because the neo-Ricardian critique has been refuted by successive Marxist analysts. Marx's equivalences are consistent within his model. In part 3, Tonak looks at the new forms of exploitation of labor, the digital economy. He argues that the digital economy can, as opposed to the opinion of many, be analyzed on the basis of Marxist theory of surplus value and profit. For example, Facebook produces commodities just like other companies. Moreover, the surplus value produced by the productive workers of Facebook is the main source of the profits of the company and the wages of its unproductive workers, not some extraction of rent. Now, that's worth looking at in a variety of ways. And the other parallel example, and particularly because you can see it as a failure or, well, depends which side you're on, I suppose, the purchase of Twitter by Elon Musk should be seen also in a similar kind of way. I don't think anyone's been written specifically about that yet. In another chapter, Savran demolishes theories that claimed after the 1980s that the world capitalist economy had entered a new stage that could be characterized as post-Fordist, implying that somehow flexibility was equally good for the worker as it was for the capitalist. The gig economy is a post-Fordist economy. On the contrary, he demonstrates that the present digital methods of labor process control, Uber and Lyft, are but even more brutal forms of the subordination of labor to capital. In another chapter, Tonak makes a very important point about modern imperialism. New theories of imperialism mostly focus on its political manifestations, such as wars, military invasion, stuff going on right now, or on the economic consequences of capitalistically imperialistic relations, such as inequality and poverty. But the real focus should be on the role played by uneven economic relations between North and South in constituting the basis of political domination. And that's the perennial issue. It's world systems theory, it's dependency theory, Andre Gunnar-Frank, blah, 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 etc. The profit motive is fundamental to imperialism, and the mechanisms of value transfer must be viewed as the means of reproducing unevenness among capitalist economies sustained by the global processes of capital accumulation. And this is that Roberts and Carcetti sort of view that in that way. In an excellent chapter, worth reading the book for this alone, Tonak and Savran summarize their views on the causes of crises in capitalism, still the key element of Marxist analysis. Like me, they characterize the world economy in the aftermath of the so-called global financial crisis of 2008-2009 as in a long depression in the lineage of the 1873 to 1896 long depression and the Great Depression of the 1930s. Depressions are an expression of the historic decline of capitalism. Tonak and Savran survey all the modern theories of crisis and trenchantly demolish them to show the superiority of Marxist theory based on the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall for understanding the post-2008 crisis. And some of the empirical data they use to support this view come from my own work, Roberts' work. Finally, in part 4, we're getting to the end. Savran takes up the Marxist cudgels in the debate with the neo-Ricardians who deny Marxist theory of value and from that, his theory of crises. Now, that's where it gets ugly. This controversy raged among left-wing economists throughout the decades of the 1970s and 80s. Savran concludes that there is no need to abandon the Marxist theory of the capitalist economy. He rebuts the neo-Ricardians' claim that Marxist theory of value is inconsistent in that it led to, quote-unquote, negative values. as negative values are pure nonsense, at least to economists. This was the basis for the neo-Ricardian proposition that Marxist theory should be consigned to history. Negative values for a value creation theory would indeed be inconsistent nonsense, but Sovereign shows this neo-Ricardian claim is a fiction. Behind the neo-Ricardian critique lies the theory of value or production presented by Piero Sraffa. Sovereign argues that it is Sraffa's theory that is internally inconsistent, not Marx's. Now, this is very deep in the weeds, and this is what some of what Cambridge capital theory is about. And you have to sort of accept or not accept, or avow or disavow that fictitious capital question. Honak and Sovereign show convincingly that Marxist capital remains the bedrock for understanding the laws of motion of capitalist production, despite fashionable attempts to revise and refute capital's analysis. It still provides the only searchlight for guiding us toward a new social formation for humanity that is not based on exploitation of the many by the few, but brings human beings and nature together in a world of cooperation and freedom. So that's the end of it. And of course, a review does not tell you all the dirty details. And what it does, of course, and which I hope that you can appreciate it, is it outlines kind of the entire path of post-war sort of Marxian thought, the problem of theory of value versus this other thing, which is Ricardian or neo-Ricardian, that is Piero Sraffa, who was at Cambridge in the 20s or 30s. Well, no more like 40s, actually. Anyway, Sraffa begins to be picked up within a whole body of folks who are working on this kind of problem, and they work on it in different ways with different results. The different results, of course, have veered off into a whole variety of other kinds of things, some of which are studied at Cambridge, others are not. And it runs parallel to a whole bunch of other things that are going on, which are interesting, maybe good, maybe bad. People need to take theoretical positions. And of course, it always winds up with kind of a power and status fight rather than something fighting about the ideas themselves. So, and then of course, there's always can you falsify it? Do you have empirical proof? Does it really work out that way? This little research program is going to go on. It's not ending here anytime soon. And unfortunately, and there's just going to be more work on this. So that's kind of my little reading of a very timely review. That is a review that just came out yesterday or whatever, that introduces a bunch of other things, plus a new book, which is not identical to it, but which raises a question along the same damn lines. And that is Nick Barnard's book on fictions of financialization. So this is still a lively topic and worth fighting about, at least within Marxists. When you start fighting with finance guys, finance people, inevitably you reach a dead end, because it still is it still is about power and greed. Okay, any questions? Brickbats.
What do you think Hudson would say?
I think he would
about this?
agree. I think he would agree.
Well, this seems to be saying that financialization isn't the sole problem, or the sole place of exploitation, right?
Yes, that's true. It has many manifestations, and one of the intervening things, which is not mentioned in the review, is the role of the state, which is really important. Well, for Hudson's view, certainly, the state controls all these things, and the financialization problem was created by institutional elements. And most of the stuff, including the thing that the guy, Samoglu, got his Nobel Prize last week, is the institutional problems of these kinds of things.
Okay.
So in what situations would you get a negative surplus value?
Well, that's an interesting question.
So-
It's trying to measure something which works against, I would assert, with all due respect, and that's kind of, and not that I'm going to assert that debt is a negative value, but I would assert that the entire system of credit debt provides negative values. Negative values in the sense that debt is a negative value, isn't it? Right? Stuff you owe.
Right, except some like banks sometimes put debt as an asset, don't they?
This is true, and that's why Hudson was talking about collateralization and why the failure in 2008, 2009 was this whole Mickey Mousing around with what counted as collateralization, right? You see
Right.
where this is going, right? It's making, it's making up things that can't be covered. Let's just put it that way. And I think you could define an inadequate collateralized debt negative in that context. Even though, yes, you wouldn't measure it that way, but if you wanted to insist upon it, I think you could. That makes sense?
Yeah, it does.
Particularly for, in terms of contracts, in terms of, when it's supposed to be due and blah, blah, blah. But no one wants to estimate it that way. The reason why the capitalists, they just kept on shoving it down the road, right? Another, the
Sorry.
debts kept on spiraling and getting out of control, and it was more Mickey Mousing around with what counted as what, and when it was due or not due, and what other ways you could get around it. And it was the fault of the state, as it were, from not stepping in and smashing some of these people.
So that's more of that's sort of the inconsistency, the Sraffa's inconsistency.
Rafa is, well, without getting into a thing, Sraffa's measurements were fairly restrictive, and we're interested in controlling the idea of what counts as a commodity in that same context. And so, there's some other things that I think that people don't talk about in terms of Sraffian analysis that are necessary in order to move the argument forward. And that's where neo-Ricardian approaches, particularly in the real estate sector, have failed, because nobody wants to move there, because nobody will cooperate with you. But and we shouldn't go down the Sraffian hole, because it is it gets real mathematical at some moment. But it is this idea that there's a certain way in which you can retain the analysis and start looking at
I know. I'm gonna feed it right now. Okay.
Well,
Hey,
well,
Sorry.
that's all right.
Well,
Anyway.
it's a rabbit hole and we don't have to go down it, right?
Well, we shouldn't go down it now. Let's just put it that way. I actually was going to return back to it, but I'll have to talk about Ricardo on rent before I start talking about Sraffa. So,
Okay.
Well, I just want to say that I find the neo-Ricardian position rather confusing, and I think they have some splaining to do.
yes, they do. Indeed, they do. Neo-Ricardianism is sort of used as a cudgel against, if you're doing it, you don't have to explain labor theory of value. You can just ignore labor. I think the whole point of being a Ricardian or a neo-Ricardian is to not have to talk about a labor theory of value. And, I don't think you should throw labor theory of value out, because I think people do operate with with theories of value. It is simply that we need to define them in well, I don't know if it's more precise, but to get a better handle on abstraction. Yeah. The value form debate is a return to trying to recuperate. And yes, I know there's all kinds of arguments related to this, but the value form debate is a way in which you try and counter, the kind of attempt to erase labor theory of value. And I'm not holding it up because it's some sort of anachronistic thing. I would assert to you that something does happen. Surpluses are created, profits are created. Now, whether you want to reduce them all to this thing called labor and then reduce it further to productive versus unproductive, you're going to get into trouble. I don't think it's troubling, because I truly believe that if you looked at it from a more ecological point of view, and I think that's why looking at eco-socialism is useful, because you look at human energy as a kind of, that fits in with other, there's people doing all kinds of stuff. And how do you account for that? I mean, you do account for it. It is accounted for in the initial labor theory of value. Why can't we account for digital labor now, right?
Yeah, it's like it's in the right direction. It's just maybe incomplete or something like that, like doesn't tell the whole story, I guess.
It is a problem of knowledge, of course, and that's why those of us who fiddle around with the problem of information are, try to work through this, because it is still a problem. That it is, on the one hand, fungible. On the other hand, it disappears. It's perishable. So, it sits with a whole variety of other problems that, with all due respect, could get worked through by a certain variety of artificial intelligence. But I don't want to go there, because that gets really crazy then. But I think it will. And artificial intelligence is not labor free, right?
Right. Yeah, that's what I mean. That's the myth of it now, is that it takes so much human labor to make it work.
I mean, you can't have AI without, um, people putting chips together somewhere, and people,
Looking at images.
oh, and well, the whole image worker stuff, that's just so far behind. No one wants to talk about it because it's too complicated. And once you start trying to do research in it, then you sort of come up against the people who make the most money at it. And that's a whole nother problem in and of itself. Anyway, I didn't mind being in the backwater of complaining about digital technology. I was never gonna, sort of lead, whatever. Did I want to become famous? Did I want my TED talk? No, not really.
Call me a Luddite.
Well, it's there. You just have to sort of make some adjustments and try not to, over determine your argument, which is kind of what Roberts is doing here. He says, well, they're trying to say that alienation is, that alienation produces a kind of, surplus value. And actually it does. I mean, I don't think there's a real argument there. It's just that when you start framing it in a certain way, you get into trouble because, well, you're creating another labor thing. And, well, yeah, Marx did it himself when he talked about fictitious capital. Yes, he referred to it as fictitious because it was ephemeral in that sense, or non-material, but it didn't mean that it didn't exist. It meant that it was there. It just that, and you had to sort of use it. I mean, it was sort of necessary to see it. You didn't just excuse it completely.
Yeah, well, it reminds me of like the abstraction with I guess it's labor, right? Like into labor power.
Yes. And well, that's exactly it. Is that so much of the explanation still was burdened by the issue of labor being identical to what workers do. It is. But that Marx goes to the issue of one level of abstraction, which is labor power, because he uses that in order to explain more fluidly the idea of a commodity and money. So all of those things that MMT are talking about are ways in which you can sort of get that to work a little better. But it's not the answer. I mean, MMT is not the answer in that context. It's just simply working out some of these other issues that hitherto people didn't study hard enough or didn't explicate properly. That's what Hudson does.
Like the mechanics of it.
Yeah. I mean, because it has actual reality, right? That people are making orders or making phone calls or doing something that manipulates all of these elements. And as Hudson tries to show, well, it did sort of become uh, very specific and operated fairly quickly. I mean, I like the fact that he puts in a kind of timetable that, you know, this thing happens and then this thing happens and then this thing happens after that. And so when you sort of spell it out like that, you can see, you know, who's evil, right? Or whatever, if you're going to make that value judgment. um, you know, Geithner should never have a public position ever again. Just, I mean, there are bad guys from Hudson's book, and I think Tim Geithner is one of them. And that guy Ackman, who's come back, you know, being, you know, highly irritating on the issue of anti-Semitism. He was part of the original problem.
Yeah, it makes me want to go back and look at Hudson's prescription of the 10 things and see, you know, how he covers that, you know, like those people, like, or whatever.
It's all about scale. You know, some people have so much wealth, and yeah, there's a big problem of how you describe what counts as wealth. You know, Trump would describe himself as wealthy, but he's
Right.
I don't think he is actually in the real sense, and which it makes him even a bigger joke. On the other hand, his behavior is just, you know, kind of raw capitalism. That is, I'm gonna overcharge the government for my Secret Service protection, you know, 3 times what they pay for hotel rooms, right?
Yeah.
I assume he's still doing that.
Well, I don't know if this is a coincidence, but you know, Trump was at a McDonald's the other day. And it just
Oh yeah,
came
I
out
wrote
that
about that.
there's a breakout of E. coli in like 10 states from Big Macs.
There we go. Well, you know, the exact store that or restaurant, I guess you'd call them restaurants, you know, they worked at they had multiple health violations. Aside from the fact that they shut the facility down in order to do this little photo op. His staff or Trumpists of one kind or another pretended that they were people coming up to the drive-up window. You know, by no means was this actual working reality.
Unfortunately, it doesn't matter. He won the day with that and got a lot of positive
PR.
press. You know?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
There's
reality does not matter.
no.
Did he have one of the, what is it? Chicken Big Macs? This new thing?
No, he was just throwing out, you know, whatever. Well, it's mainly about French fries, whatever the hell.
He got an
you know,
award for making French fries.
they gave him a little pin. How cool! I need a picture of one of those things.
And the mere fact that we are talking about it right now means he won.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
Did he have a McRib?
Where? Oh, he asked. Did he ask that? I was reading somewhere. Where do you keep the McRibs at? I think there was some side question. I think I don't know. I'm probably paying too much attention to this idiocy. There any other queries or questions or whatever? And I'm preparing to shut down the yammering.